Good afternoon, everybody. And I thought I'd do a quick video as an aside and one that will kind of help you understand the next video in the War Studies series. So during the video I've just done, I touched upon Captain America and the rules-based order. So Captain America, a very important figure that we have to understand, the Americans, and we have to understand the G7 allies and NATO. In the opposite corner and weighing in at 200 pounds, we have the Russian dolls. Now the Russian dolls do not accept the authority of the rules-based order and Captain America. Both Russia, China and America, nuclear weapon owning states with the ability to evaporate the world within 30 minutes, sit on the United Nations Security Council where they have veto powers. So these are the figureheads, if you like, although you could say that China is now actually a bigger figure than Russia, certainly economically. But in terms of military power, Russia is generally regarded as the dominant figure. That balance will change. So they are on the adversarial side often to Captain America and his rules-based order. Now, the rules-based order does not have a monopoly on international law, although it often believes that it does have that monopoly. The Russian dolls and the Chinese state and the states that they tend to align with do not have an exemption from international law, in the same way that the rules-based order may feel that it is exempt from international law and it may feel that it drives international law. It doesn't have an exemption from it. Only when Captain America, the Russian doll, China, Britain, France, and the other nations that make up the United Nations Permanent Security Council get together and make a legally binding resolution is there international law which can be applied to all countries. So they essentially have to unite to make that happen. And currently Captain America and the Russian doll have fallen out. And I'd say this could be the Chinese dragon, Charizard. Now that poses a big question, and the question it poses for law is that the rules-based order believe often that they have a right to make and to tell other states what to do. Now the rules-based order, led by Captain America, tends to be nations that are regarded correctly as democratic. They have a large amount of money. America, being the world's reserve currency, has a very strong economic position. Britain did have, but doesn't quite have now, and the Japanese are also struggling economically, along with Germany, although they tend to still be very dominant. They tend to be made up, the rules-based order, of the established or colonial powers. So these are the powers that for the past 500 years, okay, America is younger, but really these are the powers that for the past 500 years, and then since the Americans became non-interventionist, have run and dictated what happens in the world. They have strong independent medias. We use the term independent in inverted commas. They tend to be allied to their military organisations such as NATO, their strong allies such as Israel, and of course to the EU. And you have to often ask is whose interests do the rules-based order operate in? But I can't go into that in too much detail because that would be becoming politically active, something I'm not allowed to do. Now, on the other side, we have, if you like, the Russian dolls. So we take the former USSR it collapsed, and what emerged from the ashes was Russia. You could argue that actually what has emerged from the ashes of Russia is a Tsarist style state, but without serfdom. A complicated area. Essentially, the Russian doll that you need to be aware of is Putin. Now, China, I've put them in this area, although they often have differences of opinion. China is a growing dragon. It's incredibly strong. Iran tends to go towards the Russians for various reasons. So does North Korea, the North Koreans. Occasionally they all fall out with each other, just as the rules-based order falls out with each other. Now, if you try and suggest that Russia is not democratic and that China is not democratic, and you try and say in China that China is not democratic, you will get into a lot of problems. Like it or not, the fact that we would say that China and Russia are not free and independent democracies, we have to accept that the people within those states believe that they are. And when we say, you're not democratic, the people in these states look at us aghast and say, you're not democratic because you're controlled by interests. And that's part of the difference between these political systems. They both have different views of whether they are or aren't democratic. Certainly from a political scientist perspective, you would have to say that these are autocratic states. Some of them are a theocracy. Iran, the role of religion is tied into the Iranian political goals of the state. They also have money, and the key driver here is the RMB and the yuan, Chinese currency, interchangeable terms for it. We often say that Russia has no money because of sanctions and that we've turned rubles into ruble. Not necessarily correct. They do have money. They also have a media. Now, we would say that their media is non-independent, and we would regard our media as independent. Try suggesting to someone in China that their media is non-independent. They will quickly remind you that our media operates for interests and therefore is not independent. So what you have is you have a completely different view of the world from each of these political systems, and they are ultimately incompatible. Where they can meet and where international law comes in, and the rules-based order, as much as it claims to be the rules-based order, does not necessarily represent international law. What does make international law is the United Nations Security Council through binding resolutions. Now, these countries, Russia, China, and quite a lot of the rules-based order, have veto rights in the United Nations Security Council. So, for example, whilst Britain, France, and America would agree that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is illegal under international law, and they have made moves to rule via the United Nations Security Council that it is illegal, which would create international law, it can be vetoed. So China can abstain and Russia could just veto it, so it will never become law. Now, there are other bodies that represent and make international law, and they operate in something called International Humanitarian Law, or IHL. These are the International Criminal Courts, or the International Court of Justice, and International Humanitarian Law. Interestingly, Captain America is not signed up to and does not accept the authority of these courts, except when it's in the interests of America to do so. Russia, China, Also, do not sign up to and do not accept the judgments of these courts, except when it's in their interests to do so. And that is a fundamental problem in international law. If you are not accepting the authority of the courts internationally, and there is no consensus to make international law, what you have is a clash between the rules-based order and the Captain America, which says that's against the law, and a clash between the Russian dolls and associated states, which say that's against the law. And then it turns into a bit of a slanging match. You're breaking the law. No, you are. No, you are breaking the law. No, I said you are breaking the law. Whoa, whoa, you're breaking the law. No, you're breaking the law. I abstain. You're breaking the law. No, you're breaking the law. No, I said we're being attacked and they are breaking the law. You're breaking the law and attacking them. I abstain. You're breaking the law because you attacked Iraq. And what happens is the United Nations turns into a global slanging match between each of these different positions. Watching all of this, you have the non-aligned states. So you have the global south. Now, in these non-aligned states, and they do have their own alliances, there are some very powerful players. Very powerful. Now, if you take some of these states, such as the United Arab Emirates, you take Qatar, and you take Saudi Arabia, you take India, and you take Pakistan, you have very, very powerful states which will be soon tipping the international balance. Now, these states tend not to take necessarily the side of the Russian dolls or the Chinese. Certainly India doesn't take the side of China very often. And they tend to not always take the rules-based order Captain America's side of events, although sometimes they do. You also have states like Brazil and Argentina and many others. And then you have the very naughty list, which tends to contain terrorists. Now, as I've said earlier, terrorists often have political wings. So, for example, many terrorists will be state-sponsored. Iran is linked to Hamas, proscribed terrorist organisation in the UK, and it's linked to Hezbollah. So you have lots of states doing lots of things with people on the very naughty list, which is winding up the people on the rules-based order club list. The United Nations can't agree because of the veto power. States on the rules-based order don't even accept the authority of the rules-based law courts, nor do states on the Russian doll list, nor do states on the non-aligned list, although in fact they, such as South Africa, tend to be more proactive in supporting the work of these courts. So essentially what you have is you have the grounds for an enormous car crash. Now, this is all made more complicated by the collapse of the USSR. So in the Cold War, you had Captain America and Russia, or the Soviet Union, counterbalancing each other out. They counterbalanced each other. They kept the peace because both of them had enough nuclear arsenals to destroy each other within 30 minutes. And back then, people were clever, in many ways, than they are today, in my opinion. They had this idea, and the idea was called MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. So what that meant was Captain America and NATO stayed behind their side of the fence. The USSR, China, North Korea, and the other states pretty much stayed behind their side of the fence. When they did fight, they tended to do it by proxy in places like Afghanistan, where after Russia intervened and invaded Afghanistan, Captain America made lots of Rambo films. Captain America sent weapons to arm the Mujahideen. Unfortunately, for various reasons, the Mujahideen then became the Taliban, which then spawned and gave a home to Al Qaeda, which then attacked Captain America. But generally, peace was preserved because each side, the Soviet Union and Captain America, had enough capacity in their nuclear arsenals to press one button and to end the entire world by suicide. Nuclear suicide. That stability has gone. The USSR collapsed. Arms have proliferated around the world. China now has more weapons than it ever had in the past. And you can see that just by looking at the models I build. So China is arming itself. The rules-based order is arming itself. It's got massive bulging order books because of the situation in Ukraine. The Russians are rearming themselves. So what you have here is you have the stage set for an enormous global showdown where the rules of the game that controlled it and kept it safe no longer operate. I have to be careful in not being political, but as a war studies theorist, we are as close to nuclear war today as we were in 1962. Who can stop this and who can enforce the law? Well, the United Nations Security Council can't because they keep vetoing it. Neither Russia, China or America accept the jurisdiction of the international courts. So actually, what it will probably come down to is the non-aligned states, the global south as it's called, the states which don't have these nuclear arsenals and that aren't part of these camps, to sort out the mess and try and preserve peace. They are very sceptical of the rules-based order because unfortunately, as much as Captain America talks about rules, Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, Malaya, the Boer War, World War I and Suez 1956 happen to undermine the rules-based order's belief that they are the controllers and implementers of international law. Here in Britain, we're quite thankful for NATO. NATO's great, we're a member. We're covered by a nuclear umbrella. However, in Malaya, the British Army did some naughty things. In the Boer War, the British Army did some naughty things. In Suez, the British and French did some naughty things and Captain America stamped on them. In Iraq, Captain America did some naughty things. In Afghanistan, NATO did some naughty things. In Vietnam, Captain America did some naughty things. And in World War I, pretty much everyone did some naughty things. World War I's a separate subject. Why is World War I important? Essentially, because of the breakdown in mutually assured destruction, because we haven't learnt the lessons from 1962, because that generation is passing away, we are at a position now where we could be on the verge of another World War I situation. Now, the other reason why the rules-based order is not well liked by the non-aligned states is because of the past. And we'll take one example here of what was called the triangular trade and how that fitted into empire. As much as I love living in Britain, we cannot distance ourselves from history. And again, I'm talking about history here, not politics. Politics is separate. At the time in Europe, you had lots of wars. You had wars between revolutionary France and Britain. The clash of empires. Clash of empires between revolutionary France and Tsarist Russia. You also had a horrific trade and the East India Company, and you had a trade of metal and goods to Africa. You had various African states actually involved in slavery. And again, that's not controversial, that's historical. You had a horrific trade in human life called the slave trade. Absolutely horrific. Sending slaves to the Caribbean and the Americas in return for the product sugar coming back to Britain, which was then used to fuel war. In the same way, you had China. China became very weak at a certain point, it fragmented, and you have opium. You have the Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion. So we had the Boxers to the very naughty list. And what that means is that when the rules-based order are trying to enforce international humanitarian law, which does apply to everyone, irrespective of whether you're the rules-based order or in the Russian doll camp, it does apply to everyone. The laws of armed conflict, as we've covered briefly, justice in war and justice of the war do apply to everyone. Often we can upset China and we can upset the non-aligned states, particularly those that suffered from empire. And that unfortunately is used to fuel grievances for illegal actors such as terrorists. So I hope that gives some explanation as to why the rules-based order is different to international law. In part 2b and part 2c, we'll actually cover how the laws of war apply to all of these three blocks which can't seem to get along. But that is for another episode.